Hello marketer, it's Ty here and welcome to another episode of Lean Mean Marketing Teams. I'm thrilled today to bring you our guest Andrea Fryrear, President and co-founder of AgileSherpas and Agile Marketing, author and expert. Prior to co-founding AgileSherpas, Andrea spent over a decade in marketing. Her roles including content strategist, content marketer, project manager and editorial assistant for both brands and agencies. But once she discovered agile ways of working, Andrea has never looked back. In today's episode, we dive deep into the 4th annual State of Agile Marketing report by AgileSherpas and Forrester, released in 2021. This study of almost 600 marketing teams reveals the current state of agile marketing. There are some fascinating insights in the study into why teams embraced agile marketing, what benefits they're seeing, what barriers they're facing, which frameworks they're using, and how they're supporting and embedding the change. Of note is more than 50% of survey respondents are now using agile marketing compared to a traditional or ad hoc approach to marketing. And the level of urgency and importance being placed on agile has increased. Not surprising given the volatile world that we're all thrown into last year and the need for marketing teams to be more responsive to changing priorities. But some of the benefits are huge, with teams reporting greater responsiveness, satisfaction, alignment with business objectives, and less friction with other teams. So if you're not yet using agile marketing, then tune in to find out why and how you can get on board. And if you're already on the journey, you'll also be able to see how you're measuring up and if you're seeing similar challenges and benefits, as well as get some takeaways on what you can do next to get the most value from agile marketing. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Lean Mean Marketing Teams with Ty Hayes, where you'll hear from CMOs, authors and experts at the top of their game to learn how to create a modern, high-performance marketing team. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to hit subscribe so that you can be the first in line to hear each new episode as it drops. Now, let's get into the show.
Welcome Andrea Fryrear, President and co-founder of AgileSherpas, author and expert on agile marketing, to the Lean Mean Marketing Teams podcast.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Yeah, and I believe you also know Jim Yule, another agile marketing author and expert.
Yeah, it's still a relatively small world. We all kind of hang out and geek out on agile marketing periodically.
Yeah, I thought you might know him and Scott and many of the others. Jim was kind enough to be on episode 3 and we had a fascinating chat about agile marketing. I love this topic, so I'm really delighted to have you on the show today. To kick things off, I wonder if you can provide a brief summary of your career to date and perhaps where your passion for agile marketing began.
Yeah, like a lot of marketers, I kind of fell into it. I did not go to school for marketing. I have an English degree, my undergraduate's in English, and I have a master's degree in women's studies, of all things. I saw that, yeah. So an interesting sort of start to things. I used to think I wanted to be a college professor. Okay. So kind of fitting that I now teach people about agile marketing. So, it all kind of comes around in different ways. Yeah, exactly. It all dovetails. My first job after grad school was at a newspaper syndicate as an editorial assistant, and they were in the midst of redoing their website. And as a 20-something in the office, I was deemed to be somehow the appropriate person to put in charge of a website. Yeah. So I oversaw that project, which kind of then, once you have a website, you have to figure out how to get people to come to your website, which turned into SEO and search engine marketing. And then it started to just sort of snowball from there. And then as content marketing started to emerge, it was like, oh, look, my English degree is actually a profitable and marketable skill now. So went into content marketing and content strategy, working at a SaaS company. I discovered Agile there because there was an Agile software development team that we were obviously marketing the software they created, and we could not keep up. We were perennially behind and never able to kind of run at the same pace and with the same degree of responsiveness that they were running. So after a little while, I was tired of that and convinced my boss to let me go get a Scrum Master cert and try it out on our team. It was a little bit like, well, it couldn't possibly be worse than what we're doing now. And it wasn't worse. It was much, much better. And being a writer, I wrote about it on our blog, and more people started reaching out to me to say, that's cool, could you help us do the same thing? Until eventually I left and started AgileSherpas to help other marketers full time.
Love it. You can see how it all fits together from the interesting studies that you did that are now paying off, and that background in web and then software and content, and seeing the benefits and the upside of changing the way you work, I think is fantastic. Now, This podcast is all about how to design and lead high-performing teams. Agile marketing has been a topic we have explored. I've had Jim Yule in episode 3. We've had Karen Hopkins, episode 4, kind of talked about how she rolled it out with a pilot team of 50 at EY. And then Lottie Spencer from Spotify talked about it in episodes 8 and 9, a bit about Spotify method. But I'd love to make it the central theme of this episode again. I'd love to cover off the 4th annual State of Agile Marketing report that you released with Forrester back in Feb this year, including the kind of key takeaways and learnings for CMOs and marketing directors, just to get a finger on the pulse of the maturity of it, both for, I guess, the CMOs and teams that are early on their journey or perhaps thinking about it, and also what it means for those that are they've been running it a couple of years and they want to get to the next level of maturity. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
Excellent. Great. So before we go too much further, for the listeners that still aren't quite clear exactly what agile marketing is, because there's different definitions of it, what's the definition you like?
So I like to think of it as implementing practices and frameworks that allow you to focus on doing the right work at the right time. So it's all about identifying high value work, concentrating your effort into those areas until they're done, and then and only then moving on to the next thing. And so some of the best ways to do that are the agile frameworks that have emerged from software development, lean manufacturing, and things like that. So we can borrow some of those practices, and that really gives it the name Agile, right? When we take those practices and frameworks and put them to work for us. But to me, it's all about focus and prioritization more than speed, which I think is kind of one of the things that gets conflated with agility sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And I think, like Jim explained, you often hear the big A versus little a agile and the heroics in marketing and that misnomer that it's just about doing stuff faster rather than doing the right work in the right order.
Yeah, marketers are pretty good at fast. Like we've got the fast thing down. It's now about doing the right work and keeping ourselves from chasing the shiny objects.
Yeah. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about this annual State of Agile Marketing report. I believe it was the 4th one that came out in Feb this year, but how did it come to be and why was it launched?
Yeah, this is our 4th one this year. It's interesting. Its start was a bit of like all right, we need to settle this dispute a bit, because as I was going out and training more and more marketers, I was like, this is actually a much bigger thing than we had expected 6 years ago when the movement was kind of still in its infancy. And I was talking to other folks in the space and they're like, no, it's still really low adoption. Like there's maybe 10% of marketers doing this. I was like, I really think it's higher. I'm going to do a study and we're going to settle this. And so
did you win
software, the bet? I did. Well, I like to think I won the bet, right? I'm a little biased because I have the report. But the software company I worked at in my last brand side job was called Survey Gizmo at the time. They've rebranded since then. But so I knew about surveys and kind of how to run them and such. So we went out and surveyed 400 marketers, and sure enough, it was upwards of 30% using Agile. And I was like, woo! So then we've run it every year since then to be able to take a look over time now, right, of adoption levels and practices. And it's been super fascinating to see the trends now over time, what's changed and what's stayed the same over the years.
Yeah. That'd be fascinating. And what are maybe one or two things like the most striking in terms of the maturity or adoption of agile marketing now versus 4 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm gratified to see happening is the adoption levels have just been going up. This year, we passed 50% for the first time, and it's been 10 percentage point jumps for the last 2 years. So just the sheer volume of people who are really seeing the value and making these changes is exciting, because I do think it's the right way to do marketing, not only for the value we bring to a customer, the value we bring to the business, but also for the individual marketers themselves. It's a much more humane and sustainable way to do the marketing work that we all, the stuff we really want to do, right? The things that light us up and the reason we got into our jobs in the first place. So that's one. And then another that it's been interesting to see it fluctuate a bit is we always ask folks, what's the biggest barrier that's keeping you from being more agile, right? Like what's kind of got you stuck where you are? And the winner has always been a lack of training or knowledge, right? Just, I don't know enough to do it properly. But then in 2020 report, so it came out in 2020, it was neck and neck between that and my current processes are working well enough. Like this is pretty okay. there was like 1 percentage point difference between the two. And then in this year's report, my current processes work well enough went way down. It's like 2020 showed us all the cracks, right, in the ways that we were trying to work. And now it's like, nope, that didn't work. It's not working well enough. I'm convinced now.
Yeah. Exacerbated by changing modes of work, no doubt, which shone the spotlight on all the handoffs and the friction in the processes and ways of working. Great. So now diving into the latest report, how many marketers kind of took place from where, and was there anything different in the methodology this year?
Slightly different methodology this year because we did partner with Forrester and we were able to access their audience. This was the first time we partnered with them. So we saw a bit more respondents coming from B2B and a bit more in the sort of really large enterprise space. But overall, the distribution is pretty good. We get a really nice mix of respondents from smaller marketing teams all the way up through a couple thousand folks on the team. So we've got that whole spectrum represented there. We ended up with just over 600 respondents this year. And we try to get it up pretty high so that we can segment well and still have some statistical relevancy in each of the smaller buckets that we want to look at.
Yeah, when I looked at demographics and the audience, it looked relevant. There was a slight leaning to B2B, 47%, and IT services at 33%. But like you say, I think the size of company and revenue and the size of team was well distributed. So I think there's takeaways for any marketing team, no matter which kind of organization size or team size.
And it does tend to skew pretty heavily on US respondents as well, which I think the adoption levels are still higher here in the North American market, but we're seeing more coming from Europe, APAC, those parts of the world. So it's good to see it growing there too.
Yeah. Fantastic. So then zooming out again, perhaps just to the exec summary, some top level highlights from this year's report, and then we'll start really digging into the detail. So what were a few of the other key findings from this year?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was really intrigued by this year were some of the new questions that we asked. Of course, the longitudinal view is always interesting, but as the movement matures, we've started to poke at some of the newer components of it. And one of the things we asked was how other pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, have started to evolve to match the agility of a marketing team that's really adopted this properly. And it was encouraging to see that, like planning, for instance, planning and budgeting are starting to change. So these are the foundational pieces, right? You have to plan, you have to budget. But if you're still doing that in January, we're going to sit down and make the budget that's now set in stone for the rest of the year, and then expect your teams to go and execute in an agile way, you're going to have friction and it's not going to work as well as it could. So we're starting to see more respondents say, we've changed that, right? Budgets are being dynamically reallocated. The plans are being revisited at a more frequent cadence. And that's really great because the teams that we coach, right, they start to get frustrated when they're moving really fast and then the apparatus around them is sort of slowing them down. So to see that it's expanding now beyond just the kind of team level execution, I think bodes well for the future.
And some other highlights I kind of picked out was a high percentage still continuing to struggle with unplanned work. Definitely a topic I want to touch on. Obviously still favouring hybrid models, which I think makes sense with Agile. It's not one size fits all. But the big one being more optimistic about their ability to handle the pace of digital marketing and respond to emerging ops and stay aligned with business objectives. I think that as a headline is some of the most powerful ones because that goes to the heart of any marketing team being able to keep up with that. So some great high-level findings in there. Then I thought the report headings might be a useful structure for the rest of the chat. So starting with which marketing teams are embracing agility, what does the report tell us on this topic?
That one was fascinating. So this was a new question for us this year as well, where we wanted to see, we have that high-level view of what percentage of marketers really broadly are using Agile, but then sort of zooming down into what does that actually look like, which functions, which teams inside of the marketing department broadly. And the guess I would have made before we saw the data was that it's going to be website, right? It's going to be digital, the folks that tend to run into agile ways of working because they interact with that part of the business. But no, they're like, third, I think it is on the list. And you're seeing like creative, operations, and content coming in at the top spot, which is awesome, right? As a content marketer, I'm like, yes, you guys need it really badly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's cool to see such a high level of adoption there. And then demand generation and ABM are in the second place. So for me, the sort of takeaway from that whole question was, this works for everyone. There's no excuse, right? To be like, oh, well, we're creative and we don't need process. And it really helps to create space for creativity and strategic thinking by having these ways of working kind of protecting you from the craziness of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I rolled it out in team when I was CMO and creative services team, I thought there'd be some resistance to it. But once they flipped from chaos to Kanban boards and prioritization of work and full transparency, and then having meetings with other stakeholders saying, this is the backlog, this is what we're working on, and individual kind of team members taking cards, it just changed the game so much, because creative services teams, there's always more demand than supply. So they really need that system to optimize their workflow and provide that transparency. The other thing I wondered on that, you touched on it, was, usually the adoption may be influenced by whether the teams run into other digital teams that are used to work in that way. But I also wonder what your views on as to whether those different levels of adoption reflected on where the greatest benefits can be gained by Agile, so like the impact. Does it reflect on the composition and willingness of the people in the team, so their confidence with rolling it out? Or does it say something about the level of ease to implement Agile for that function? Like, have you thought about that in relation to how those numbers fell?
Yeah, I think you're probably right that there's a mix of factors going into it there. And it's really interesting because I've worked with multiple creative services teams, and there is this interesting like cultural dynamic. Some of them really are resistant and they dig their heels in, while others are like, they can see kind of intuitively, like you're saying, the value of visualization of the work and how much better things would be if we could all see what we're doing and help one another out. So I feel like they fall to extremes more than some of the other functions do. I mean, there's probably aptitude or like where you are on the disc profile or something like indicates whether you're going to like this or not. That might be an interesting question for next year. Like, what's your personality type? And then how much do you like Agile?
Yeah. You're a control freak or not, and you're open to change and trying new things. And I also noticed, events and brand management towards the bottom, which didn't surprise me. Like, I think some people have the view that events are waterfall. There's a fixed date and we need to do things at certain times, and that's the way it is. But I've still seen some real advantage in using Agile practices for events. Like, again, Experience picked one of our largest events, Open Day, which has 20,000 people and hundreds of stalls and big teams involved, and went from having one project manager to run the show and try to gather up everyone to manage the project chart and get things done on time, to Scrum and teams coming together and visualizing the work. And we had the website done 4 weeks early, the brochures done 4 weeks early, and the project manager no longer had to whip people and ask where things were, because there was transparency and accountability of people standing up and saying what they worked on. So I think, there's perhaps always room for Agile practices, even if something's a little bit more waterfall. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. And I've seen an events team who, again, was a bit like, I don't know about this. But once we started doing it, they were so uneven in their work distributions because they would take ownership of particular events. And this was a financial services group that was running like 100 events of various sizes throughout the year. And I would own these 5 and not really think about, 3 of them happen in May, right? And so I'm just insane running around in May, whereas my colleagues are kind of sitting around like, I don't have anything going this month, like, sucks to be you. But once you got the backlog and everything going, one of the things we did with that team that I haven't done with all teams, but worked really well for them, was we put little dots to indicate the work that was not required to be done by the event owner. Like, maybe they could, but if you're an event specialist, you know how to handle vendors, you know how to do the tasks, even if it's not for your particular event. And so it was shocking to them how much of the work actually could have been shared among them, even if they kept ownership over their particular events. And so it helped kind of smooth that work out a bit, and people weren't just crazy when their events were coming up. So again, like, maybe it's more of a waterfall thing, but just implementing some of these practices, the right ones for the right team at the right time, you have this potential to just unlock all kinds of improvements.
Yeah. Love that. And it comes back to the cross-functional teams and being T-shaped and, jumping in where you can to help the rest of your team to achieve the result, which is good. The other thing I noticed was that brand management again, and I know I've talked with a few CMOs and marketing directors on Agile, and that seems to be a sticking point where you've got the really serious brand marketer. I'm not rushing an MVP TV commercial, TV commercial, or if our brand has high quality illustrations or things that take time, they don't want to cut any corners there. But I think, again, there's still principles of Agile marketing that can be adopted. But through your experience, what have you seen teams, brand managers or brand management teams do well in terms of embracing Agile without risking quality of the output?
Yeah, quality, it's got to still be part of the equation for sure. But, there's ways to test into some of the larger releases or the larger campaigns and initiatives. It de-risks some of it as well, right? If you're doing the giant commercial or the huge media buys or whatever it is, you would probably like to know that what you're putting out there is the right thing, right? And digital and social can help you test that, test the message, test the visual, test the influencer, test all of these components of it before you drop 7 figures on the big bang thing. So you can still have that as your ultimate kind of release moment, but do it with confidence because you tested and iterated on the way to it, right? The thing that I always think about when we talk about this kind of big bang moment is like Peloton's big commercial. I guess it's 2 or 3 Christmases back now, where the husband bought the bike for the wife and they had this huge backlash to the commercial and to all of that. I'm like, test and learn a little bit before you throw that out there, and maybe you won't have to deal with that. Yeah,
there was something very similar in the Australian media recently where I think they would have loved to have tested a particular campaign that they got very wrong. So yeah, that's great examples. And the other thing I noticed in that first section was there just seems to be a great level of importance and urgency being placed on Agile. I think, coming out of COVID, 26% saying Agile is a major initiative, 21% saying it's the most important initiatives, and then, almost 50% looking to implement Agile, and of that, 92% within the next year. So was that striking? Like definitely an increase on the previous years in terms of that importance and urgency?
Yeah, but not as much as you might imagine. We tend to see I think there's a lot of aspiration in that question. Like, yes, I'd really like to do this in the immediate future. And we don't always see it play out. Like you would expect a huge jump next year, right? If those numbers are accurate.
They've done that,
We don't always see people follow through on what they're hoping to do. But I do think 2020 was like the year that we realized we needed Agile. There was just no other way to handle what was going on.
Okay, so moving on to why and how marketers are going Agile. What were the main findings in this section? And again, did you find anything surprising or encouraging?
The thing that was probably not surprising, but reflective of last year's realities was the importance people are placing on tools, because everyone was distributed and our pretty walls of, sticky notes are no longer a viable way to manage work when we all went home. We saw a lot of folks relying on a digital project management tool to help them make this a reality. And I think it's really important, but I can't ever let that question go by without saying, yes, tools are important. Tools are not all there is, right? Like going and buying a fancy, shiny Agile project management tool is not going to solve your problems. It's just going to make visible the problems you already have.
Yeah, I think there's a real danger in that, isn't there? That if they don't have the training on the mindset and the principles and the values and the practices, and you just suddenly make work transparent without building the trust and the philosophy in the team, then it can actually almost backfire and create more chaos in the team.
And people are like, this Agile thing is terrible. And you're like, no, it just showed you everything that was already terrible in your process.
Wow, there's been a lot covered in this interview so far. As a marketing leader, we know you like to spend more time taking action and less time taking notes. So we've got you covered. We packaged up all the tips, strategies, and resources from each episode into some beautifully crafted notes just for you. Not ugly AI-generated transcripts, but real notes taken by a real person on our team. To grab the notes, head on over to growthgenerators.io, look out for this podcast episode and download the notes. But be quick, they're only live for a few weeks after the episode airs. Now, back to the show.
Looking at some of the other reasons why they're adopting it. So, it was 65% ability to manage changing priorities, improve productivity, accelerate delivery. So again, all makes sense given VUCA of last year. And I think it'd be great to see how that changes with the maturity though as well, coming back to one of the first principles of Agile around customer. Being first, and we'll satisfy the customer as early as possible, and the importance of really aligning to the business and delivering business outcomes. It almost feels like the agility and the changing prioritizations is the hook that gets them in. But once people start learning Agile, they kind of transcend to higher level benefits, which is around that prioritization and the actual customer and business outcomes. Is that what you found?
Yeah. I think it is important. And it does come pretty quickly, right? If you're talking about prioritization frameworks and things, right? Like what's the most important work to do? What goes to the top of the backlog is usually a good moment to say what work will deliver value to our customer as quickly as possible. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Agile inside of marketing is for our clients, that tends to trigger a conversation about, well, who is our customer? Right? Is it an internal stakeholder? Is it the end user of whatever product or service that we sell? It's probably a little bit of both. And how do you then balance the work being done?
And when you have multiple internal customers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's make it even extra fun. Right. And they don't ever agree on what the top priority is going to be. And so if you have leaders that are able to kind of step into that and say, great, now this is an opportunity for us to talk with our stakeholders about whether or not the work they're asking us to do does deliver value to our customers, because it's shocking to me how often those stakeholders cannot articulate the customer value of the work they're bringing to marketing. They're like, well, I just want you to do it, to be able to then have the conversation to say, okay, well, we could do it, but why would we do it? Is really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. So then in terms of the educational steps being taken, again, I noticed that Agile marketing specific courses and train the trainer programs were two at the top, then with kind of Agile courses and long-term coaching at the bottom. So again, I think that reflects the maturity where, 5 years ago, it might have been Scrum and product owner training as the main things, whereas now I think marketers are realizing that Agile marketing is a bit different to Agile for software. So get the right training, which is good. So on to the benefits and battles facing Agile marketers then. What are some of the benefits that marketing teams can expect if they embrace Agile marketing?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to see it kind of line up with why did we go Agile and then what are the benefits we're seeing. They usually jive pretty nicely in the report. So people are seeing, yes, I can manage changing priorities. Yes, I can get my campaigns to market faster. The ones that I always like to see on there too are like better employee engagement and kind of happier people is a really important thing, especially when marketers are that connection between the business and the customer. If they're stressed out and always kind of racing from one fire to the other, the work they put in front of people is not going to be their best.
Yeah, I love that. And some stark differences, I guess, between the Agile marketing teams and the ad hoc teams. Like I know you compared them with traditional teams and ad hoc, but I like that satisfied with how the marketing department manages its work. Was it 67% compared to 21% at ad hoc? So teams happy with how they manage it, which is pretty huge. 30% say their work style causes team friction. So pretty low compared to some higher levels for the other teams, so it causes less friction. And yeah, like we talked about before, the department being able to take advantage of emerging opportunities, it had 82% versus 44% for ad hoc teams. So some pretty compelling evidence there in terms of some of the benefits that can be gained for sure. And in terms of that measurement, I love the way you included that question this year on how you're measuring the results of adopting Agile. And I think, like the report says, it's quite distributed. You've got effectiveness, efficiency, management value, team value, stakeholder value. I guess from your experience, what are some of the best measures that marketers should put in place to measure the successful adoption of Agile marketing? Yeah,
I think some of that depends on why you're doing Agile in the first place. So we do have some of our clients who, for instance, have really low employee engagement one quarter, and they realize that they're burning people out, right? And that it's sustainable pace and more work-life balance and employee engagement numbers are the why of Agile for them. And so they need to focus on those kinds of metrics when they're going Agile. And then other folks are concerned about just how long it takes work to get into the market, right? How many times do we have to go round and round? How many rounds of review do we have to have? So then we need to track that, right? What's the number of times work goes back and forth between us and our stakeholders? That's the metric. So it's, I think, should be dependent on the problem you're trying to solve. with agility should be the way that you measure its effectiveness. But whatever that why is, I think we also need to be able to prove that Agile is making marketing better, that the outcomes our work is delivering are improving when we are working in this way. So to me, there's always kind of two halves of that equation, right? Is the work working better, and are we able to do more of the work? So that's that kind of effectiveness and efficiency, both halves.
And I ask a question in my podcast, the Fast Five. One of them is how you measure team performance, and internal kind of team NPS comes up a bit, around that kind of team satisfaction. And I like the way around the iterations and how quickly you come out, because it kind of goes to the heart of the importance of those retros, doesn't it? And constantly reviewing your processes and making them better, which makes your work less frictionless, which should improve your happiness at the same time.
Yeah.
So then coming to this sticky problem in terms of challenges that are being experienced as results of using Agile, and this number one, the difficulties managing unplanned work. Talk to me about that. Why do you think this comes up so high, and what can marketing teams do about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just not going away, right? Like for many of us, that's part of the reason why Agile in the first place is we can't predict, we can't plan effectively what's coming our way. And so we need a system that's designed to handle unpredictability. The sort of like nitty gritty mechanics of managing the unplanned work, I think, comes back to the visibility. So I know teams that will tag cards, whether it was like planned and in the sprint versus unplanned and came in, and then we can start to see how much of the work is actually predictable versus unpredictable. And then we can decide, is that too high? Is that okay? Like, what does that tell us about the framework that we should be using? So I think visibility is step one. And then also making sure that wherever the source of the unplanned work is, that they can understand the impact that it's having, right? And so once we visualize like percentage of planned versus unplanned, we can also then say in the planned heavy sprint, right? The sprints where we could do most of the work that we wanted to do, we tend to get these outcomes, right? So kind of down the road, our work is more impactful, generated more MQLs, more whatever the metric is.
Yeah.
Whereas when the unplanned work tends to be higher, then our outcomes tend to be not as good. And now we've got a data-driven place to start this conversation instead of stop interrupting us and let us do our work over here.
Yeah. It goes to the heart of a lot of things, I think, for me, like whether they're trying to use Scrum when Scrumban or Kanban might be better. If they're still allowing work to come in during a sprint, then maybe it's a method or a mix of methods that they need for different teams. Said that perhaps misperception from leadership or other stakeholders that your team's agile now, right? So we can just change tack on a dime and constantly changing priorities, especially if it's at the objective or strategy level. And you've talked about in your book can have big repercussions, that stability in the strategy and the OKRs, and then your initiatives can be a little bit more fluid. And the other one I noticed in that list was this people reverting to non-agile approaches. I think that's the muscle memory, perhaps going on the diet and then the diet of Agile and getting some quick hits and some results, and then after a little while going back to the chips and the beers. So what is it about that? Is it just the Kubler-Ross change curve, and change is hard and you need to stick with it, and people need to see the benefits early and leadership support and the right sustenance and embedding, thinking through the longer term plan rather than let's launch a pilot and see what happens?
Yeah. I do think that part of it comes down to leadership support and their mirroring back, right? Like they're embodying agile ways of working and the agile mindset also, and not just having some expectation that other people are going to change and not me. But then I think too, the way you approach it, right? Like, is it a pilot that we run for 3 to 6 months and then we're done, versus that was step one of many, and an understanding that this is going to be a long-term, iterative, transformational change, and not just about buying a tool and having daily stand-ups and then call it done. So the way you position it and the way that you started off, I think, impacts whether you're going to get that long-term buy-in. We talk to the leaders that we coach a lot about telling the right story, right? As a transformation owner, part of your role is to really paint that picture of, here's the beautiful, promised land that we're all trying to get to. Is what it's going to look like. And we're not there yet, right? But it's getting better, and to really kind of drive that story forward.
Yeah. And then, like you say, practicing what they preach. So perhaps changing the leadership meetings to stand-ups instead of 2-hour project meetings and really demonstrating, going to the training on Agile rather than
please go to the training. Go to the training.
Yeah, being a student of it, being in the tools in the system, or having your Kanban board up if you're still on analog and working in an office. Okay, so then what are some of the other biggest barriers preventing marketing departments from fully implementing it?
Yeah, I mean, the lack of knowledge is up there. I always get worried when we're talking to a new client and they're like, well, we're pretty much doing this already. Like, we're pretty much already Agile. Rarely is that true. It's the little A Agile, where we move fast and break things and change our minds a lot, but there's no rigor, there's no discipline, there's no prioritization. There's still, even multiple years in, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about what agility really means and what it's supposed to look like. And so when people think we're 80% of the way there, and then you talk to a consultant or a trainer who says, you're like 10% of the way there, it can be a little disheartening.
Yeah. And I think that kind of plays out in your report, some of what they are adopting in terms of whether it's stand-ups or sprint planning or retros. What does it say about overall Agile marketing maturity? Like, which frameworks are most popular? And yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing that fascinates me, is connection or lack thereof, maybe, between the low number of marketers that say they're using Scrum, for instance, which was only like 19% compared to over 50% that's using a hybrid framework. But then when you get down into the practices question, lots of folks say we are doing sprint planning, we are doing sprint reviews and things like that. So I think it's indicative that there's still a lot of fixation on the sprint as a mechanism for managing work. And sometimes that works and is appropriate, but I think more often we would benefit from breaking free of the iterative cycle, right, of time-boxed iterations. Yeah. And getting into more of that continuous flow because of unplanned work, because of marketing, just in general, tends to be a more, I think, realistic style of Agile for us. And over time, right, I think it will be interesting if we continue to favor hybrids, which I just think we will, right? Because we are not the teams for whom Scrum was built, right? We're super different and our work is different. So I wouldn't expect to see us gravitate back in that direction. But over time, it will be interesting to see if we see a corresponding decline in the teams that are doing sprint planning and sprint reviews and those really time box specific ceremonies, and whether we see more pushes toward the flow-based practices.
Yeah, so keeping on that then, I know the importance of, say, WIP limits and that prioritization. Have you found many teams that are doing it well go to that degree where they put limits either on columns or team members or time, however they choose to do it, and what is usually most effective in terms of where they start and what to aim for?
WIP limits, I feel like, are one of those things that if you can convince people to try it, it's transformative. But it sounds so hard when you're first introduced to the concept to say, you mean I can only work on a couple of things at a time? You got to be kidding me. Have you seen my to-do list? And so it's really tough. And we spend a lot of time when we train people to like take them through some simulations to show like, no, really, when you do this, it actually pushes things across to done much, much faster. But I think WIP limits is low on the list of practices being used. And I think it's a strong indication of whether people have done their homework and educated themselves, either been trained formally or done like a really good job of finding and self-educating, whether they are getting to that level. Because it's easy to find information about Scrum and say like, oh, okay, let's try that because it's obvious and out there. But then WIP limits is harder. And I see a lot of people start with it at the individual level. So like, we don't have a team WIP limit necessarily, but everyone on the team only works on 2 things at once. That tends to be a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads around first. And then you can start to say, well, let's limit it at the column level or the stages of the workflow. Once you've got that muscle sort of starting to develop, and you can say, no, I'm not going to start that right now as an individual. And then you can start to have that conversation as the team. But I think the big thing is just limit, right? The mechanic of it is almost irrelevant at the start, but just get used to saying no to stuff.
Yeah.
So that you can focus on the high value work.
Yeah. And the data's revelatory, isn't it? When you see the 20 items in a to-do list versus 10 and the time it takes to get to done on that. Constant teams being frustrated about how things take so long. And if they could only get more cars off the freeway, everyone will get there sooner.
Right. And convincing the people trying to put the car on the road, right? Convincing your stakeholders that are like, no, just get it started and then it'll be done faster. Convincing them that it's actually better for you to not start it right now is like a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Lastly, then, yeah, we've covered a lot. We've talked about the state of maturity of agile marketing, the barriers, some of the benefits, the most common methods. We've likely got listeners in a couple of different camps, those that are still yet to start, maybe in 50% that aren't there yet, as well as those in a greater level of maturity. What's your advice firstly for those thinking about it in terms of the best steps to get started? And then we'll touch on those that are ready to scale.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of drumbeat right now is don't try to pilot in a project. Like if you're getting started, don't try to get people to do 30% agile on this one project on the side of their desk. It will not work. It never works. You've got to have people who are working agile the vast majority of their day. That's how the frameworks are meant to function. If you want to start, you can either start with kind of simple practices, visualize work, right? Get it all out there, get everybody's work into backlogs and onto boards. So you just understand the scope of work, which is usually quite shocking and surprising the first time you do it. And then you can start to think about whether you've got the right teams put together to deal with all the work once you see it. It's teams, right? It's people, it's teams. That's where we apply agile ways of working. So if you haven't started, you got to think about teams, not projects, places to implement. It's a big mistake that I see a lot of marketing leaders make.
Yeah. And getting that right mix of cross-functional teams with the right size. How did teams do that quickly? Because again, I do org design work as well, and some of those projects can take quite a long time. And some leaders may not realize the size of the challenge in terms of changing the composition of the teams and the way they work. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean total reorg and change in org structure, does it?
No, not necessarily. Yeah. Depending on how you're structured now, right? You may be able to get away with applying agile, at least initially, to your existing teams, right? And then again, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to realize where the bottlenecks are and where the biggest opportunities for improvement are. So then you can concentrate your change management on the things that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, as opposed to trying to be like, everyone's on new teams tomorrow, which is quite scary for marketers who tend to go through reorgs like every 18 months or so anyway. So people tend to be quite nervous when we start talking about restructuring and things, but you can do this iteratively, right? Kind of in stages.
Yeah. Excellent. And lastly, for those CMOs that are well on the journey and they're looking to get to the next level of maturity, what should they focus on next?
When things start to reach that level of maturity, my favorite thing to get people thinking about is, so how do we structure ourselves around customer value, right? How do we structure ourselves in a way that's not internally focused around product lines or business units or what have you, but around the customer, right? So we focus on this segment or this audience or this stage of the customer journey, right? Those kinds of ways to really get fixated on the customer. And then our agility really does kind of deliver that value so fast and so often, and we become experts in that customer's life cycle. And then I think you kind of hit that next level.
I love that. And I love the way that it is flexible because, again, in different org models and agile, you can structure around all those different elements, either segment, stage of journey, stage of funnel, whatever it might be, is one of the beauties of it. But putting that customer value front and center is great advice. And any last things for the CMO? We talked on some of the things that they can do to give it the best chance, but any changes in their own behaviors? Obviously, they need to show support, but what else can they do to ensure the successful adoption?
Yeah, I mean, at the CMO level, I think you need to become kind of this meta heat shield, right? So making sure that there's not a lot of disruption and interruptions and unplanned, unnecessary stuff getting thrown at your teams, being able to push back on kind of your level and your directs level to say, no, we're not going to take that right now. And it is okay to say no to the VP of sales and to really kind of empower people to say like, Agile is us now, right? And we are going to do this. And I'm going to also be modeling the behavior that I want from the teams.
Yeah. Love that. Well, Andrea, that was a fantastic discussion about the report. Thank you again for sharing that. And I encourage listeners to get a copy of that. It'll be in the show notes. And Andrea's also got a fantastic book called Mastering Marketing Agility, so check that out as well. But before we wrap up, it is now time for our Fast Five. Are you ready?
I think so.
So what do you believe are 3 essential capabilities or criteria of a high-performing marketing team?
I think growth mindset. So, the willingness to grow and change and evolve always. Data-driven decisions. So not your gut, but the data. A team-centric mindset, right? Like we succeed or fail as a team, not as individuals.
Yeah, love that. And how would you describe your team's culture in one word?
If I only get one word, I think I have to say agile.
Yeah, seems a bit loaded, doesn't it? What's one metric you've successfully used to track and measure team performance?
We do team NPS. So we take NPS at the start and end of every week, just kind of how are you feeling and how are you doing, which I think is really important right now. Everybody's working too much and burned out.
Yeah, for sure. And what's one skill or capability you've learned recently you wish you'd developed much sooner in your career?
Oh man, just carving out time, like blocking time on my calendar for the really important things, strategic work, like to just sit and stare at my whiteboard and draw stuff, right? And just like do that kind of intellectual work that doesn't feel like work, but really is super important.
Yeah, so hard, isn't it? As a kind of business owner and consultant and yourself as an author and everything else you got going on to prioritize your time for that strategic thinking. And what book or books have you found yourself recommending to others or that you think our audience would gain value from?
Personal Kanban, one of my all-time favorites. I give it to everybody on my team when they join. It's just spectacular for getting a handle on your own massive avalanche of life stuff. I've used it for ages to run my business, run my life, run my family. My kids know how to do Kanban boards. So it's amazing.
Brilliant. That one to the show notes. And where can people go to get in touch to learn more about yourself, Agile Sherpas, your books?
Yeah, AgileSherpas.com will have everything you need to know. There's a free chapter of my book. The State of Agile Marketing report is there for free download. I am content marketer. We're a content first business. So there's huge amounts of free resources there. I have a very weird last name, so I'm very easy to find. Andrea Fryrear at Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm easy to find.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on the show. I was excited before it. I knew it'd be a fascinating chat. And I love digging deep into this topic. And I think you've shed a lot of light on the state of maturity of agile marketing. You've had a lot to do with that maturity, obviously helping a lot of organizations go agile. So thank you for all the great work that you're doing and for coming on the show.
It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Lean Mean Marketing Teams with Ty Hayes. This podcast is brought to you by Growth Generators, a consulting firm that helps CMOs design and build modern marketing teams that drive growth. If you need help optimizing your marketing team, head to growthgenerators.io.